My name is Dessa, and I was 31 years old when my brother stood in front of our extended family at a Sunday dinner and said, "She only helped to feel superior."
He was talking about me.
About 5 years of monthly transfers I had been sending for our mother's treatment costs, $2,200 every single month. Never late, never short. I had set up the arrangement because my brother lived locally and I was 3 states away, and he had volunteered to manage the invoices, coordinate with the providers, make sure the money went where it needed to go. I trusted him with that because he was my brother, and because my mother needed care, and because I was working long hours and couldn't be there in person. What I didn't know for most of those 5 years was what was actually happening to the money. I didn't respond that Sunday. I heard what he said, I noted it, and I went very quiet in the way I go quiet when something important has just been confirmed. Because I had already started asking questions. And I had a file, not complete yet, but growing, that was going to make that Sunday dinner look like a minor opening act. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in an estate attorney's office with itemized records spread across a conference table, and the room around me went a very specific kind of still. Welcome back to Chaniel, where quiet people build the file before they open it. New here? Hit subscribe, and if you've ever been called ungrateful for something you paid for, drop a 3 in the comments right now. I want to start with the kind of person my mother was because she is the reason any of this happened, and I want you to understand her before I explain what was done in her name. My mother, Vivian, was a practical woman. She had grown up in a household where money was managed carefully and spoken about plainly, and she had carried that approach into her own life, without apology. She worked as a medical billing specialist for most of her career, which is its own kind of irony, given what I'm about to tell you, and she was good at it in the way that people who have an instinctive feel for detail and procedure are good at things. She knew how invoices worked. She knew how reimbursements worked. She knew how to read an explanation of benefits document the way most people read a menu. She raised 2 children largely on her own after my father left when I was 9, and my brother Marcus was 6. She did not dramatize this. She did not narrate our poverty or our difficulty. She just worked and managed and kept the lights on and made sure we both had what we needed for school, and she did it with a specific, unshowy competence that I absorbed more than I understood at the time. My name is Dessa. I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I left at 22 for a contract compliance position at a manufacturing firm in Indianapolis, Indiana. The work was dry and detailed, and I was suited for it in the same way my mother had been suited for billing: an instinct for discrepancy, a tolerance for paperwork, a preference for things that could be verified. I was not a dramatic person. I was a thorough one. By 30, I had been promoted twice, was managing a small team, and had a reputation in my department for catching errors that other people missed. I drove a practical car. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment that I kept orderly. I had a small but consistent investment account and an emergency fund I treated as a boundary rather than a suggestion. I did not live extravagantly, not because I couldn't afford to make different choices, but because I had grown up watching my mother make the math work with not quite enough, and that early education in financial sobriety had become part of how I moved through the world. Marcus stayed in Greensboro. He had done a year of college and then come back, worked a sequence of jobs: warehouse, delivery, a brief period managing a storage facility, and had settled into a life that was, from the outside, stable enough. He had an apartment, a long-term girlfriend named Patrice, a social life centered on a group of friends he'd known since high school. He and my mother were close in the way that children who stay local are close to parents, proximity creating a texture of relationship that distance makes harder to maintain. My mother and I were close differently. We talked on the phone every week, Sunday evenings, and those conversations were long and substantive. She told me things she didn't tell Marcus, not because she preferred me, but because I asked different questions. She told me about her finances. She told me about her health. She told me, when I was 28, that she had been having some joint problems that were affecting her mobility and that her doctor had referred her to a specialist. That specialist referral was the beginning of a treatment process that would extend, in one form or another, for the next several years. The diagnosis was a manageable but chronic inflammatory condition, not terminal, not immediately debilitating, but requiring ongoing care, periodic injections, and a physical therapy regimen that her standard insurance covered only partially. The out-of-pocket costs were real and recurring. My mother did not ask me for money.
I want to be precise about that.
She told me about her situation, matter-of-factly, the way she told me about everything, and I made a decision on my own. I called her back the following Sunday and told her I was going to set up a monthly transfer to cover what insurance didn't. She said it wasn't necessary. I said I knew it wasn't necessary, and I was doing it anyway. She said she would keep a record of everything and pay me back when she could. I said there was no need to pay me back, but if it made her feel better to keep records, she should keep records. She was, after all, a medical billing specialist. Keeping records was her native language. Marcus had volunteered to coordinate the practical side of things, scheduling, managing the provider invoices, making sure the payments got where they needed to go. This made sense. He was there. I was not. The arrangement had a clear and reasonable logic to it, and I had no reason at the time to question it. I set up the transfer, $2,200, first of the month, every month. I told myself it would run for a year, maybe two, until my mother's condition stabilized and the therapy regimen found its equilibrium. I did not anticipate 5 years. But things compounded the way chronic conditions compound. One treatment leading to a referral, leading to a secondary specialist, leading to a new protocol, and I kept sending the money because the need, as described to me, kept being real. My mother's neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Aldridge, had known our family for 20 years. She was 73, sharp, and she had the particular observational clarity of someone who has watched a neighborhood for decades and noticed when things changed. She gardened in the morning, walked in the afternoon, and had a habit of calling me once every few months just to check in, the way older women of a certain generation will maintain a line of contact with the child who moved away. I valued those calls. She told me things, not as gossip, but as information she thought I should have. It was Mrs. Aldridge who first made me look more carefully. The call came on a Sunday afternoon in early spring, about 4.5 years into the arrangement. Mrs. Aldridge and I had been talking about my mother's garden, which she had been tending in my mother's absence during a recovery stretch, and then she went quiet for a moment in the way people go quiet when they're deciding whether to say the thing they actually called to say. She said, "Dessa, I don't want to cause trouble, but I've been thinking about something and I decided I'd rather say it and be wrong than not say it." I said, "Tell me." She said she had been to 2 of my mother's recent appointments with her. My mother had asked her to drive during a stretch when her mobility had been particularly limited, and that the billing statements she had seen in the car, the ones Marcus typically handled, had seemed higher than what the appointments had involved. She said she wasn't an expert. She said she might be misreading it. But she said something had felt off, and she'd been carrying it for a few weeks. I thanked her. I told her she'd done the right thing by calling. I hung up and sat with what she'd said for about an hour. Then I called my mother. My mother, when I asked her about the billing, was vague in a way that was unusual for her. She said Marcus handled all of that. She said she trusted him to keep track. I asked if she had copies of the invoices. She said she thought so, somewhere, but that it was all in a box that Marcus had been managing. I asked if I could have the account number for the separate care account that Marcus had suggested we set up, a dedicated account into which my transfers went, from which he paid the providers, so that I could review the statements directly. She said she'd ask Marcus and have him send them over. The statements did not arrive. I waited 2 weeks. I called my mother again. She said Marcus had been busy, but he'd get to it. I said I'd reach out to him directly. She said that would be fine. I texted Marcus. He replied the next day, on it, just swamped, give me a few days. A few days became a week. A week became 2. I texted again. He said the account had switched banks, and he was tracking down the new statement access. I noted the pace of the delay. I noted the escalating specificity of the explanations. And I did what I do when something I'm tracking starts producing inconsistent data. I started building a file. I went back through my own bank records first, something I should have done periodically and had not because I had trusted the arrangement and had not built verification into my own process. I pulled every transfer. 72 months, first of the month, $2,200 each. I listed them in a spreadsheet with dates and confirmation numbers. The total, when I added it up, was $158,400. I paused on that number for longer than I want to admit. I had known intellectually what 5 years of transfers added up to. Seeing it in a spreadsheet column was different. Then I called my mother's primary care office directly. I explained that I was her daughter, that I had been covering her out-of-pocket costs, and that I was trying to reconcile some billing records. The receptionist was helpful within the limits of what she could share. She confirmed that my mother was an active patient, that she had been seen regularly, and that her account with their office was current. I asked about the total billed out-of-pocket over the past 5 years, specifically for services not covered by insurance. She put me on hold. When she came back, she gave me a range. It was considerably lower than what I had been sending each month. I said, "Can you tell me roughly what a typical month looks like for her, in terms of out-of-pocket costs?" The figure she gave me averaged somewhere between $400 and $600 per month, depending on the quarter. I was sending $2,200. I thanked her and ended the call. I sat at my kitchen table in Indianapolis with my spreadsheet open, and I did the arithmetic that I had been, without fully acknowledging it, avoiding for some time. If the actual medical costs averaged $500 a month, and I had been sending $2,200, the gap over 5 years was somewhere in the range of $80,000 to $100,000. Sitting somewhere I had not authorized it to sit. I opened a new tab and searched for state and trust attorneys in Greensboro, North Carolina. I had a consultation scheduled by the end of the week. I had not yet said anything to Marcus. I had not yet said anything to my mother. I was building the file, quietly in the way I built files at work, methodically, sourcing each entry before moving to the next, not drawing conclusions until the documentation supported them. The Sunday dinner happened before the file was complete. It was my mother's birthday. She was turning 62, and I had driven down from Indianapolis to be there. Marcus had organized the gathering at my mother's house. Immediate family, 2 aunts, my cousin Brienne, Mrs. Aldredge from next door. It was the first time I had been home in 6 months, and I came with a specific quietness that I recognized in myself as the particular stillness of someone who knows more than they are showing. The evening was pleasant on its surface. My mother was in good spirits. The food was good. The conversation moved the way family conversation moves when everyone is making an effort. And then, toward the end of the meal, Marcus made a toast. It was, at first, a toast to my mother, warm, practiced, the kind of thing he was good at. He talked about her resilience, her strength, the way she had raised the 2 of us. And then, in the middle of it, something shifted. He said, "And I want to acknowledge that this past year has been hard. Managing Mom's care has been a full-time job, and not everyone has contributed the way they should have." He did not look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. One of my aunts said, "What do you mean?" And Marcus said, still in the tone of someone giving a toast rather than making an accusation, "I mean that some people write a check and think that's the same as being present. And when the check was late this month, just once, 1 month, I got questions about my management. Like I've been doing something wrong." My aunt said, "Was it late?" He said, 1 month. And I had to hear about it. Then he said, in the measured voice of someone who had been waiting to say this for longer than this evening, "I've never once suggested that Dessa's contributions weren't appreciated. But I will say, and I think the family deserves honesty, that the way she holds it over us has always been more about how it makes her look than about Mom. She only helped to feel superior." The table went quiet in the specific way that tables go quiet when someone has said the thing that was already in the air, but that no one had expected to be said out loud. I looked at my water glass. My jaw had tightened to the point where I could feel my back teeth pressing together. My hands were flat on the table, and I kept them flat, deliberately, because the alternative was to pick something up, and I did not want to pick anything up. My mother said quietly, "Marcus." He said, "I'm just being honest, Mom." My Aunt Patricia looked at me. My cousin Brienne looked at the tablecloth. I said nothing for a long moment. Then I said, in a voice that was level and clear, "I'll need the itemized invoices from the last 5 years. All of them. I'd like them by the end of next week." Marcus said, "You're really going to do this tonight? At Mom's birthday?" I said, "I'm asking for records. That's all." He said, "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Everything has to be on your terms. You send money, and that means you get to audit everything, is that it?" I said, "I just need the records, Marcus." He shrugged. the shrug of someone who has decided the exchange reflects well on him, and changed the subject with a smoothness that suggested he had practiced the pivot. I drove back to my mother's that night. I was staying in my old room, and I lay in the dark for a while looking at the ceiling. The file I had been building had just gotten an addition. The fact that Marcus had raised the alarm about my scrutiny before I had formally requested anything. That kind of preemptive defense had a specific shape I recognized from my work. It was the shape of someone who knows what's coming and is trying to control the narrative before it arrives. I called the estate attorney I had consulted the previous week. I left a message. I told her I needed to move the formal document request from a consultation to an active engagement. The attorney's name was Ms. Fontaine. She was in her late 40s, methodical, with the particular manner of someone who had spent 20 years in family financial disputes and had arrived at a place of complete unshockability. She did not express surprise at what I brought her. She asked questions and took notes, and at the end of our second meeting she said, "Let me tell you what we're working with." What we were working with was this. Ms. Fontaine had sent a formal request, on her letterhead, to Marcus and to the bank holding the dedicated care account, citing my status as the funding source and requesting full transaction records for the account's history. Banks respond to attorneys differently than they respond to family members. The records arrived within 10 business days. Ms. Fontaine and I went through them together. The account had received $158,400 over 60 months, my transfers every one. Of that, payments to verified medical providers, my mother's primary care office, the specialist, the physical therapy clinic, totaled $26,200 over the full 5 years. Slightly under 2 years' worth of what I had been sending spread across 5 years of actual care. The remainder, $132,200, had been dispersed in a pattern that Ms. Fontaine walked me through line by line. A recurring transfer to a personal account registered to Marcus. Payments to what appeared to be personal vendors, a car payment, a furniture installment, a home improvement contractor. A cluster of transfers in the second year that aligned with the period when Marcus had mentioned, in passing at a previous family gathering, that he and Patrice had renovated their kitchen. Ms. Fontaine said, in her even way, "The invoices he provided to you over the years, do you have copies?" I said I had some. The ones he had occasionally forwarded, which had looked plausible, clinic letterhead, line items, reasonable amounts. She looked at them alongside the actual provider records. She said, "These don't correspond to any billing from these providers. The letterhead matches, but the invoice numbers don't exist in their systems." I looked at the documents side by side and felt something go very cold in the back of my throat. Ms. Fontaine said, "I want to be precise about what I'm telling you. The documents he sent you were fabricated. Not altered, fabricated. The provider names are real because he had access to them. The amounts and invoice numbers are invented." I said, "How do you want to proceed?" She said, "That depends on what you want. There are several avenues. The most immediate would be to present this documentation at a formal family meeting, one where the relevant parties are present and the record is established in front of witnesses. After that, the options open up depending on how the conversation goes." I thought about what I wanted. I thought about it carefully, the way I thought about things at work when a situation had multiple resolution paths, and I needed to choose based on what the outcome actually needed to be, not just what felt most immediate. What I wanted was for the family to know, not for a legal process to grind forward in private, producing a settlement that nobody talked about. I wanted the people who had heard Marcus call me superior, call me transactional, call me someone who helped only for the credit. I wanted those people in the room. I told Ms. Fontaine I wanted the meeting. She said she would arrange it. My mother had a quarterly check-in with her primary care provider that was already scheduled, a routine appointment that had evolved, over the years of her treatment, into a small family touchpoint, the kind of gathering where whoever was local would stop by the house afterward for coffee. Marcus came to these. My aunts sometimes came. My cousin Brienne usually came. It was, in other words, a room that assembled itself naturally, without requiring anyone to engineer a gathering. Ms. Fontaine said she would attend as my representative and document custodian. She said she would be unobtrusive until I indicated it was time. I called my Aunt Patricia the week before and told her, without details, that there was something important I needed to raise at the gathering, and that I wanted her there, and that I needed her to stay through the whole thing. She said she would be there. She asked if everything was okay. I said it was going to be clearer soon. I drove down from Indianapolis the Friday before. I stayed with Mrs. Aldridge, who had a spare room and who had, when I told her in general terms what was happening, said, "I knew something was wrong. I'm glad you listened." She made me dinner and didn't ask more questions than I was ready to answer, which was exactly what I needed. The morning of the gathering, I put on plain clothes, dark trousers, a simple top, flat shoes. I made coffee. I sat at Mrs. Aldridge's kitchen table and went through the folder one more time, not because I didn't know what was in it, but because I wanted the contents to be so familiar that nothing in that room could rattle me. I drove to my mother's house at 9:30. The appointment had been at 8. By the time I arrived, my mother was back, settled in her chair, and the coffee was already on. The house had that particular Saturday morning quality: low light through the front windows, the smell of coffee and something baked, the eased pace of people who are somewhere they belong. My mother was in her chair near the window, with a small blanket across her lap. Marcus was in the kitchen, moving around with the proprietary ease of someone who considered himself the host. Patrice was at the table. My Aunt Patricia had arrived and was sitting across from my cousin Brienne. Mrs. Aldridge had walked over from next door and was standing near the counter with her coffee. Miss Fontaine arrived at 10:15. She knocked, was let in by my aunt who opened the door, introduced herself as my attorney and document representative, and sat down in the chair near the bookshelf with her briefcase on her knee. She was not dramatic about it. She simply sat down and was present. Marcus looked at her from the kitchen doorway. Then he looked at me. I was sitting on the couch near my mother's chair, and I was looking at my coffee cup, and I did not look back at him right away. When I did, I met his eyes and held them for a moment, and then returned to my coffee. My face was arranged in the particular neutral I had been practicing since Indianapolis, the one that does not invite interpretation. He said, from the doorway, in a voice that was aimed at pleasant, "Dessa, who's this?" I said, "My attorney. She's here to help me go through some documents." He said, "Today? This is Mom's post-appointment coffee. This isn't really the time for." I said, "I've been asking for the itemized records for 6 weeks. This is when I have them." Patricia looked up from her coffee. Brienne looked at Marcus. Mrs. Aldridge, near the counter, went very still in the way of someone who has been expecting something and has just seen it begin. My mother said quietly, "What records, Dessa?" I said, "The invoices for the treatment fund, Mom. All 5 years." The quality of the room changed. Not dramatically, not with raised voices, just a slight shift, the way air pressure changes before weather moves in, the kind of thing you feel before you can name it. Marcus came out of the kitchen doorway and stood in the middle of the room. He said, "We've been through this. I manage the account. I handle the invoices. You've been kept fully informed of everything relevant," Miss Fontaine said, from her chair, in a tone that was entirely without escalation. "Mr. Marcus, I've received the full transaction history for the care account directly from the bank, pursuant to a formal request. I also have billing records from each of your mother's medical providers covering the same period. I'd like to walk through a comparison, if that's agreeable." He said, "I don't think that's necessary." She said, "It may not be necessary, but it would be clarifying." Patricia said, "I think we should hear it." Marcus looked at Patrice. Patrice looked at the table. Ms. Fontaine opened her briefcase. She did not rush. She laid 3 documents on the coffee table in the center of the room: the full transaction history from the bank, the compiled billing records from my mother's 3 providers, and a 1-page summary she had prepared that put the 2 side by side with totals. She said, "Over 60 months, the care account received $158,400 in transfers from Dessa's account. Of that amount, payments to verified medical providers, confirmed directly with each office, totaled $26,200. She paused to let the arithmetic settle. She said, "The remaining $132,000 $200 was distributed from the account in transfers and payments that do not correspond to medical billing. I have the line item breakdown here if anyone wants to go through it. My Aunt Patricia picked up the summary page. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Her reading glasses were on, and she moved down the page with the focused, deliberate attention of someone who is making sure she understands what she is reading before she reacts to it. My mother had not moved. Her hands were in her lap, and she was looking at the summary page from a distance, not reaching for it, as though proximity to it required a moment of preparation. Marcus said, "Those transfers, some of those were for things related to Mom's care. Transportation, home accommodations, equipment." Ms. Fontaine said, "I've accounted for a category of ancillary costs. The remaining gap after all plausible care-adjacent expenses is still over $100,000. He said, "There are invoices that explain it. I have them." She said, "I've cross-referenced the invoices you sent Dessa against the provider's actual billing systems. None of the invoice numbers in those documents appear in any provider's records. The letterhead matches, but the documents don't correspond to any actual billing." The room received this in silence. My mother's hand went to her collarbone and rested there, very still, the way a hand goes to the body when the body needs steadying. Patrice had turned in her chair so that she was no longer facing the table. She was looking at the window. The line of her shoulders had changed, the ease gone out of them, replaced by something careful and braced. Marcus's jaw had tightened. He said, and his voice had lost the smooth, reasonable quality it usually carried. You hired an attorney and came into Mom's house and did this today? The day after her appointment." I said, "I asked you for records 6 weeks ago." He said, "This isn't how family handles things." I said, "I agree. It isn't." Mrs. Aldridge, from near the counter, said very quietly, to no one in particular, "Lord." My Aunt Patricia set the summary page down on the coffee table. She smoothed it once with her palm, a precise, deliberate gesture. Then she looked at Marcus with the expression of a woman who has known him since he was 6 years old and is in the process of revising that knowledge into something she does not yet have a name for. She said, "Marcus, did you take this money?" It was not a question exactly. It was the sentence form of someone who already knows and is giving the person one final chance to be the one to say it. He said, "It's more complicated than that." Patricia said, "Then explain the complication." He didn't. My mother said, from her chair, in the quietest voice I had heard from her in years, "Marcus." Just his name. And then nothing else. But the way she said it contained everything. The 30 years of managing on her own, the billing statements she had understood better than anyone, the specific sorrow of a woman who has just been told, without being told, that she was the vehicle for something she would never have sanctioned. I looked at my mother and the tightness in my chest, which had been there since Indianapolis, since Mrs. Aldridge's phone call, since the Sunday dinner where my brother had called me superior in front of the family. That tightness did not release exactly. But it settled. It found its right shape. I said, "Miss Fontaine has copies for everyone who wants them." Then I picked up my coffee cup, which had gone cold, and I went to the kitchen to pour a fresh one. I stood in my mother's kitchen for a few minutes while the room behind me worked through what it had just been given. The conversations that followed, that afternoon, that week, in the weeks after, had different textures depending on who was having them. My Aunt Patricia's was immediate and direct. She came into the kitchen while I was still there, stood next to me at the counter, and said, "I owe you an apology for things I half believed without asking you." I said she didn't need to apologize. She said she thought she did, and she was going to anyway. Brienne texted me that evening. A long message that started with "I had no idea," and ended with "I should have asked questions a long time ago." Patrice left the house before noon. I did not see her go. I heard the door. Marcus left shortly after. He did not say goodbye to me. He said something to my mother, quietly in the hallway, that I couldn't hear, and then I heard the front door. My mother and I sat together that afternoon after everyone else had gone. She didn't talk much. She looked at the summary page for a long time and then put it down and looked out the window at her garden, which Mrs. Aldridge had been keeping for her during the stretches when she couldn't manage it herself. She said, after a while, I should have asked for the statements myself. I said, "You trusted him. That's not the same as doing something wrong." She said, "I know the difference between an invoice that adds up and one that doesn't." I should have looked. I said, "You were the patient. You were allowed to let someone else handle the paperwork." She reached over and put her hand on mine for a moment. Her hand was thin but warm, and she held on for just a few seconds, the way she had when I was small, and something had frightened me. Then she let go and looked back out at the garden. Marcus called me 4 days later. His voice had the careful, stripped-down quality of someone who has had days to sit with something and has arrived at a place that is not quite resolution, but is past the point of argument. He said he knew what he had done. He said things had gotten away from him. The renovation, a period when his own income had been short, a logic of borrowing that had kept not resolving itself. He said he hadn't meant for it to go on as long as it had. He said he knew those explanations didn't change the number. I said, "Miss Fontaine will be in touch about a repayment structure." He said, "I know." I said, "I need you to understand that this isn't about me and you. This is about what Mom's care was supposed to be funded with. The repayment is for her account, not mine." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understand that." I said, "Okay." We worked out, through Ms. Fontaine, a formal repayment agreement. It was realistic, structured over a long enough period that it was actually achievable, and it was documented, witnessed, and filed. The first payment arrived on schedule. Ms. Fontaine noted it. I updated my records. My mother's actual care costs, now that I had direct access to the provider billing, turned out to be manageable and considerably lower than the figure I had been sending. I set up a direct payment arrangement with each of her 3 providers, bypassing any intermediary, with statements going to both my mother and me. She reviewed them herself. She was, after all, a medical billing specialist. The relationship between Marcus and the rest of the family entered a period of recalibration that was quiet and slow and did not resolve cleanly in any direction. My Aunt Patricia continued to be in contact with him because she had known him since he was 6. My mother had phone calls with him that I was not part of, and about which she told me only what she chose to tell me. I did not push for a particular outcome. What happened between them was theirs to navigate. What I had needed was the record to be correct. The record was correct. Here is what 5 years of misdirected transfers taught me about the space between trust and verification. Trust extended without structure is not generosity. It is an invitation for structure to be provided by someone else, and whoever provides that structure will provide it according to their own needs, not yours. I sent money for 5 years and never once asked to see a full accounting because asking would have felt like distrust, and distrust felt like an accusation. I confuse scrutiny with suspicion. They are not the same thing. Scrutiny is care. It says, "This matters enough to me that I am going to pay attention to it." Suspicion is fear. I was not afraid of my brother. But I should have been paying attention and I wasn't, and that cost my mother's care fund $132,000 over 60 months. The thing I did right was keep my own records on my end, the transfers, the dates, the confirmation numbers. I didn't do it because I expected to need them. I did it because I was the kind of person who kept records. Sometimes your habits protect you before you know you need protecting. And when the moment came, not because I manufactured a scene, but because I prepared documentation and put it in front of people who deserved to see it, I let Miss Fontaine do the talking. I poured a cup of coffee. That was the right call. That's my story. A fabricated invoice, a bank transaction history, and a 1-page summary that changed what everyone in that room knew. Now I want to ask you something specific. Have you ever been in a position where someone you trusted with a financial responsibility, a family member, a partner, anyone, turned out to be handling it differently than you understood? What made you finally look? Was there a moment, like Mrs. Aldridge's phone call, that made you stop explaining it away? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.